Hi, I'm Charlotte. Welcome to Lottie Talkie. This video will be the first in a series of videos in which I will try to analyze some of the themes and questions raised in the Loki series. Today I want to start with the question of what the series tells us about variants, and in particular, how far can it be said that two variants of the same character are in fact the same person? It is a question that has no clear answer because, as is often the case with this show, things are very nuanced and the show tends to avoid giving straightforward answers to the very complex questions it raises. As is often the case, I intended this to be a short video, but I ended up with way too many things to say, so I will do this one in two parts. Part 1 will be focused on the TVA's attitude to variants and will cover the following points. How does someone become a variant? The TVA's essentialist attitude to variants, and the special case of Mobius. Part 2 will be focused more on the case of the Loki variants, in particular Sylvie, who in my opinion is the one that really debunks the TVA's dogma. So I will talk about Sylvie as the counterexample that debunks the TVA's dogma, what makes a Loki, and finally the enigmatic behavior of He Who Remains. So let's get into it. How does someone become a variant? First, to discuss how variants are connected, it seems essential to try and understand how the sacred timeline is supposed to work. Like many other viewers, I was rather confused about this at first, and I really need to thank all those who made videos about this, those who wrote articles, to try and understand what Walt explained in one of his interviews, and also people on Twitter who helped me figure out some of the things I wasn't sure of, in particular Captain Asia. Thanks for discussing this with me. So I hope I'm getting this right now. At first glance, while watching the show, you might get the impression that the sacred timeline is just one timeline. One version of the story in which there are prime versions of every character, if you will, and any other timeline that exists is a branch that must be pruned. But Michael Waldron tried to explain the sacred timeline in an interview, and it actually turns out that it's something quite different. For example, he said, okay, the best I can explain is that time is always happening. So there are infinite instances of time always occurring at once. There are minute little fluctuations in each instance of time. So in you and I's conversation, 5 times out of 10, I pick up and I say hello. And 4 times out of 10, I say, hey, nice to meet you. And then maybe 1 time out of 10, I'd say, hey man, beep you, I don't want to do this interview. So even within the sacred timeline, there are still various timelines that exist simultaneously with many possible variations in the script, which can be tiny or big deviation. So the sacred timeline is not one timeline, it's more like a collection of timelines that are allowed to exist by the TVA. And the TVA only considers something a nexus event when the deviation becomes bad enough that it can cause a scenario that they want to avoid. And in turn, characters are only considered variants when they cause a nexus event, and then they must be pruned. So if you follow this logic, two versions of the same character are not necessarily variants. In fact, they could coexist simultaneously or even at different times, because they say time is circular, in fact, or on different timelines, as long as neither of them does anything that creates a nexus event. They would be tolerated by the TVA. Besides, it seems that a nexus event which creates a branch does not mean that the initial timeline splits into two timelines. So it would mean that in fact it's the entire timeline that becomes a deviation from the baseline, and that must be reset. In other words, it is completely destroyed. On this point I still have a doubt, because the show was very vague as to what exactly the reset charges really do. But it seems to be the most likely explanation. So the impression, which was my first impression, that certain Lokis like Kid Loki or Classic Loki were likely to be from the same timeline as TVA Loki but maybe diverge at an earlier or later point in their lives, is probably not correct. It seems more likely that each of the Loki variants that we see in episode 5, for example, came from a different timeline to begin with. Some of them had almost exactly the same story as MCU Loki with small variations, so that's why they look similar and they're so similar to MCU or TVA Loki. others probably had large deviations which were tolerated by the TVA for a while until they became too big. And that led to the TVA pruning these variants and resetting their timelines. So this would explain not just things like alligator Loki, but also why Sylvie wasn't arrested until she was about 13 years old. This suggests that until then, her version of Loki was allowed to coexist with MCU Loki, for example, inside the collection of timelines that the TVA considered acceptable. And the reason why they allowed her to reach this age, but then arrested her, remains a mystery, like many other things about Sylvie and about the TVA, in fact. We do not know much about how the TVA defines variants and acceptable variations, and why they even bothered to extract the variants from the timeline before they reset the timeline. They could just reset them together with a timeline. So my hypothesis would be that they probably want to collect information on them, so the trial is just, it's a pretend trial. They're not really trying anyone. They're just trying to collect as much information as they can about variants, maybe to try and perfect the system. But that's only my hypothesis. We will have to wait until season 2 to actually know more about this. However, what we can do already is have a look at how the TVA treats variants in season 1 of the series. The TVA's essentialist attitude to variants. When considering what defines a person, the two concepts that often come up are nature and nurture, which means, on the one hand, your essence, your nature, what is your core identity and is supposedly unique to you, distinguishes you from the others, and supposedly cannot be completely changed. It is supposed to be constant. And on the other hand, your lived experiences, nurture, which can actually mold you and change you. For example, your education, your culture, your upbringing, positive experiences, and also traumatic experiences, and so on. So it's always an interesting philosophical and sociological debate to try and determine how much of a person is nature and how much is nurture. But obviously my ambition here is not to settle this huge question. It is only to look at the TVA's discourse on variance and how it relates to these notions. Besides, to make things even more complex, in the Loki series there is another thing to be taken into account, which is that this series has a very strong metafictional dimension in which the TVA actually acts like a scriptwriter who defines how a person must behave on their own timeline. In other words, people are treated like characters in a narrative. In fact, the director Kate HERRON explained in an interview that in her opinion, Sylvie and Loki are both Lokis, but they aren't the same person. And what really connects them is that they sort of have the same role in terms of the universe and destiny. Still, we do not really know how a person is assigned the role of a Loki in the TVA's narrative, because we do not know much about the process of creating the sacred timeline or monitoring the sacred timeline. Do the Lokis share an essence, like a nature that is common to all of them? Is it the TVA or He Who Remains that assign a specific role to certain people based on this common nature? We could think that variants all share a similar nature to begin with and that this explains the similarities between them. But we could also think that maybe their similarities come mostly from their life experiences being very similar, because they broadly follow the same script. So in other words, does the TVA make use of similarities that already exist, or is it their intervention which creates the similarities between the variants? Is it nature or nurture or a combination of both? Of course, I cannot give an answer to these questions because we don't really know, but we can have a look at how the TVA considers variants. What we can see by looking at the dialogue is that the TVA seems to present their role as being a natural thing. For example, these are the words that Mobius uses when trying to break Loki in episode 1.
It's funny, for someone born to rule, you sure do lose a lot. Might even say it's in your nature.
You weren't born to be king, Loki. You were born to cause pain and suffering and death.
So this would imply that it is in a way inescapable. Loki cannot escape his narrative loop of failure and isolation because it's in the natural order of things. It is in his nature. He was born for this. Still in episode 1, Mobius also makes sure to hammer home the idea that Loki never truly had any agency.
You lived within your set path.
I live within whatever path I choose.
Sure you do.
Choices are my own.
Your choice is your own. Good, let's go with that. I think this one's going to fire you up.
So basically, in this framework, it is doubtful whether nurture even really exists, because everything is presented as being predetermined in a kind of natural order of things that cannot be escaped. Whether your identity comes from your nature or the experiences you've lived makes little difference, because you never had any agency anyway. It's all been written for you. However, just because Mobius presents it in this way doesn't mean it's true. It makes sense for the TVA to present things like this because it is their task to limit people's freedom. By taking away people's ability to choose, they take away, in a sense, their power to define their own identity. And just like any authority whose task consists in imposing an oppressive norm upon people, they try to present this as something that is grounded in nature. It is the natural order of things, even though of course we know it's not. It's at least partly artificial, because otherwise the TVA would not be needed. And directly correlated to this essentialist dogma is the fact that the TVA does not recognize variants as individuals or even as people. Their humanity is often denied. There are examples of objectification when B-15, for example, is briefing her team in episode 2 and she says,
"And if you see a Loki, prune it."
Note that she uses it, not him or her. At another point she calls Loki a cosmic mistake because of his status as a variant, and at another point we can also hear Renslayer comparing Loki to a broken thing.
Look, I know you have a soft spot for broken things.
I don't think so.
Yeah, so again, this idea that variants are things, not people. So the reason why I call their attitude to variants essentialist is that the TVA's dogma sees variants not as individuals but as copies of one another, who are supposedly all defined by a similar nature, or their essence if you want, and they cannot claim to have any singular identity therefore. And they also present their own work as a natural process which is inescapable in order to mask its artificial and arbitrary character. And the reason why they do all this is quite obvious. It's a necessary rationalization to justify what they are doing. Because as soon as they started recognizing variants as people and individuals in their own right, instead of mistakes or flawed versions of other people, then they would have to admit that what they're doing constitutes mass murder. Because the act which they routinely perform of resetting a variant or resetting a timeline apparently equates to exterminating a huge number of people. And this is something that they would find much harder to do if they acknowledge that variants are in fact individuals. There is, however, in this big cold machine, one example of a TVA worker who never seemed to fully subscribe to this dogma, and it is, of course, Mobius and Mobius. The special case of Mobius. Among the TVA workers, only Mobius seems to undergo a significant evolution in his attitude to variants, except maybe for B-15, but we don't see enough of B-15 to make it a very interesting analysis, unfortunately. So I will focus on Mobius here. As we've already seen, he starts out with the same essentialist vision that the TVA enforces. The way he talks to Loki about his supposed nature and what he was born to do fits this dogma. In episode 2, he tells Renslayer,
I realize that my, methods with this Loki are controversial.
The use of the demonstrative "this Loki" is a way to show that he only considers him as one Loki among others. So they're basically interchangeable. Still, in conversation with Renslayer, Mobius also explains that his strategy to use one Loki to catch another Loki rests on the idea that all Lokis behave the same.
The variant likes to stall for time, and eventually we'll catch the other one doing the same thing, because understanding this Loki helps me get closer to the one we're chasing.
And at first it might seem like he is right, because Sylvie does thank Loki for helping her stall for time in Roxcart.
Thank you for helping me stall for time. You really do love to hear yourself talk.
So this might seem like it confirms Mobius' theory, but once we actually meet Sylvie in episode 3 and we get a chance to see her in action, she turns out to behave very differently from our Loki. Sylvie is very methodical, single-minded, organized, patient, focused on carrying out her plan, whereas Loki is chaotic, gets distracted or bored very easily, and improvises all the time. And this of course aggravates Sylvie, who ends up calling him a clown. Therefore, the idea that studying Loki might help the TVA understand how Sylvie functions seems rather misguided. And indeed, this strategy does not work. It does not work out the way Mobius had planned at all. It is worth noting, though, that even as early as episode 2, Mobius already seemed to display a slightly different attitude to Loki, at least, if not to variants in general, because when talking to Renslayer, he said,
And hey, if it doesn't work, I'll delete him myself.
So he said him, I'll delete him myself, not it, like B-15, for example. So we can see there that he was already beginning to see Loki as a person. But the pivotal moment for Mobius was really episode 4. This is when we see his attitudes to variants change drastically. One very interesting bit of dialogue takes place at the very beginning of the episode.
But if they want me to find Loki in the variant, I need access to Mother C20.
The way Mobius says Loki and the variant, even though in theory they're both Lokis and they're both variants, it shows that Mobius has grown to really form a bond with this Loki, and he sees him as an individual in his own right now. Still, when interrogating Loki, Mobius reverts to the TVA's essentialist position. He mocks him for falling for himself, so suggesting that he and Sylvia are basically the same person. And he insists that he and Sylvia are two variants of the same being.
What an incredible seismic narcissist! You fell for yourself. Two variants of the same being, especially you, forming this kind of sick, twisted romantic relationship.
Being is a synonym for person, and it also means essence, so the idea that they're exactly the same, they're basically the same person. And he also responds with sarcasm when Loki insists that the other variant is called Sylvie.
Oh, Sylvie. Lovely. How do you spell that? Is that with an I-E or just an I?
Yet this interaction with Loki actually sows the seeds of doubt in Mobius's mind, and this is reflected in the way that he, in turn, uses the name Sylvie when talking to Renslayer about the variant.
Why wouldn't you let me interrogate Sylvie?
Sylvie?
And this, of course, precedes the soul-crushing revelation that he himself is also a variant. Note that Renslayer, in contrast, only uses the name Sylvie when trying to talk Sylvie down in episode 6.
Sylvie? Not thinking of going on the run, are you?
When she talks to Mobius again, she speaks dismissively of a couple of Lokis, showing that she never really went through the same evolution and she still considers them just interchangeable, all Lokis.
Eons of friendship. And you threw it all away on a couple of Lokis.
And yet, she also appears to be aware of the fact that TVA workers are all variants, because she was clearly involved in covering up this information when C20 was threatening to reveal this to everyone. So, this is interesting. Maybe this difference between Mobius and Renslayer is another way of raising the question of how similar experiences might affect different people in different ways. Was it in Mobius's nature to have more empathy? This is really something you can notice about Mobius from the very beginning. He really seems different from other TVA workers because he shows a lot more empathy. So, was this in his nature to have the ability to see beyond the dogma and recognize variants as people, as individuals? While Renslayer seemed to be blindly committed to her mission, even though she knew that TVA workers were variants. In any case, there is at least one clear example of how wrong the TVA's vision of variants is, and it is the example of Sylvie. But I will keep this discussion of Sylvie and other Loki variants for part 2. So stay tuned, and thank you very much for watching part 1 of this video.